And so we're ready to begin. And with that, I now introduce our speaker, Robin McGraw. Robin received her doctorate from Western University, traveling widely through the Canadian Arctic for more than 25 years to write about Inuit literature, and has a subspecialty in Northern exploration literature. She was an associate professor of Canadian literature at the University of Alberta and is the author of 24 books and several hundred articles. She is currently a columnist with the Northeast Avalon Times. I now turn the evening over to Robin McGraw to deliver her presentation, The Mysterious Lambert de Boilieu. Robin.
Thank you very much, John. Historians and amateur historians such as myself often spend many fruitless hours in archives and libraries trying to track down obscure bits of information. These labors often result in only a sentence or two, or even none at all, when the research results are written up. However, it's the journey rather than the destination that is sometimes so satisfying, and I thought that it might interest you to follow me on one particular search to see what is involved in uncovering snippets of the past, particularly as it relates to Newfoundland and Labrador history. Some years ago, when I was doing research on Inuit map making, one source I was relying on was a groundbreaking academic monograph by geographers John Spink and D.W. Moody. The authors suggested that decorated Inuit maps may have served no practical purpose, and that Inuit map makers were unfamiliar with European conventions of map making. Yet when I was able to view one of the maps discussed in the monograph at the American Museum of Natural History, I found that it was drawn on the back of an 1867 US Coastal Survey map, and the decorations supplied information omitted in the survey map. This experience taught me to view original documents whenever possible, rather than transcriptions or reproductions. The wisdom of getting into an archive and working with original papers and photographs was brought home to me once again when I set out to write about the author, Lambert de Boilieu, and found myself confronting not one, but two anonymous authors, both of whom appeared to have worked on the same tiny island in Labrador in the same year. I offer my findings, speculations, and thoughts about these two writers, in part because I think they serve as a warning to readers to be cautious when approaching some of the books written about unfamiliar places. During the coronavirus lockdown of 2020, with all bookstores, libraries, and archives closed, I began rereading books about Labrador that I had read in the past, before I knew very much about the region. I was surprised to discover how differently they read with 12 years of Labrador familiarity under my belt. One book in particular not only surprised me, but also puzzled me, Lambert de Boilieu's Recollections of Labrador Life, first published in 1861 by Saunders Otley and Company in London and reprinted with editing and notes by Thomas F. Bredon in 1969 for Toronto's Ryerson Press. It was the reprint that sat in one of my bookcases until, in a moment of idle curiosity, I pulled it down and began to reread it. Reflections of Labrador Life is quite a small book, as you can see. Just 118 pages by de Boilieu and 24 pages of introduction and notes by Bredon. But it is a lively and a charming read, and I was in a mood to be charmed. There were some rather questionable observations in de Boilieu's text that made me wonder if the man was taking the mickey out of his gullible readers. And there were a few short passages that seemed overly familiar, considering that it had been at least 10 years since I'd first read the book. But on the whole, I took the work at face value, a memoir by an educated and pious Englishman who had spent some years in the 1850s at Battle Harbour, working for T&D Slade of Poole. The pandemic, having brought most businesses and entertainments to a grinding halt, I was given time and space to think about de Boilieu a great deal. The more I thought, the more the man and his book puzzled me. Out of curiosity, I had a look in the 6 volumes of the book Newfoundland, but found no entry for him. Ditto the Newfoundland and Labrador Encyclopedia, the Dictionary of Newfoundland and Labrador Biography, O'Flaherty's The Rock Observed, and Neary and O'Flaherty's Part of the Main. Nor does he show up in W.G. Gosling's Labrador, Its Discovery, Exploration, and Development. I found him cited in the 2nd edition of the Dictionary of Newfoundland English and mentioned in Sean Cadigan's article, Battle Harbor in Transition, but he is merely mentioned and the references are to the 1969 reprint. In desperation, I turned to the internet, with which I am not particularly familiar, but I thought that anyone who had written such a book would have a footprint of some kind. Again, there was nothing about the man to be found. Google, as is its wont, offered me up several candidates who spelled their last name differently from my target. I located a brief reference to a 16th century French composer named Gérard de Boilieu, erroneously identified as Lambert de Boilieu, but no Boilieu. I contacted Dr. Graham Skanes, a rare book dealer, who told me that the original publishers, Saunders, Otley & Co., were reputable in their time, but best known for fiction. He also suggested I contact one Lambert Boilieu, currently living in Montreal, which I attempted but got no reply. Nowhere could I find any trace of anyone who might have gone by the name Lambert de Boilieu. He was a ghost, and I began to wonder if his editor, Breton, had pulled off an elaborate hoax. Breton, according to the little I found about him, was, as his brief biography on the dust jacket of the Ryerson book, the assistant headmaster of a private school in Winnipeg with 2 previous books to his credit. He appeared to have no Labrador connection at all, but he did have a Newfoundland connection, in that his daughter had attended Memorial University. I contacted her in New Brunswick, and she was more than willing to answer my questions, but admitted that she was very young when he published the book. She was so devastated when he died in 1979 that she simply had no idea what happened to his papers. In fact, Kate Breton was unaware that the book her father had edited was a reprint of an early edition. She thought he had found the manuscript in a Manitoba archive. It was time to go to more experts. Joan Ritzie, former head of the Center for Newfoundland Studies, said she knew the name but nothing else, and kindly offered to have someone at the center check it out. Staff at the center came up empty. Hans Rollman admitted having read the book and was able to assure me that there really had been an 1861 edition, and forwarded a digital copy to me, which eventually was useful in solving a few minor mysteries. Jacob Bachinger out in Alberta admitted that it was a book he'd always been perplexed by. Though it's one of the liveliest titles about Labrador, he wrote, I thought it was riddled with tall tales. He's clearly someone to take with a large grain of salt. Anthony Jenkinson in Shahiji judged that the book doesn't seem to be egregiously worse than many other accounts from that period, but admitted that it has its fair share of nonsense. I sat down and read the book for a 3rd time. Dr. Rollman's digital copy of the original printing allowed me to determine that the footnotes, which contained 2 egregious errors that could not have originated with someone who had been several years in Labrador, were added by the editor. The 3rd time through, however, at least 2 of the familiar echoes I had noticed sounded a bit clearer. Breton, at one point, footnotes a description of an old squaw duck lifted from Cartwright. De Boilieu admits in the text to having read Cartwright's journal and uses Cartwright's spelling, such as gigger for jigger, kiak for kayak, and square fripper for square flipper. With the help of Eva Luther's index to George Cartwright's journals of transaction, I was able to confirm that he lifted whole sections from Cartwright without crediting him. For example, Cartwright wrote in his glossary, gigger or jigger, a pair of large hooks fixed back to back with some lead run upon the shanks in the shape of a fish. The gigger, being let down to the bottom, is played by sharp jerks, and such fish as are hooked by it are enticed by the resemblance of the lead to a real fish. De Boilieu's explanation of a jigger is that the fisherman used a double hook cast in a mold called a gigger, the hooks being fixed back to back with some lead run down upon the shanks in the shape of a fish. The gigger being down to the bottom is played by sharp jerks, and many fish are enticed to it by its resemblance to themselves. This unattributed borrowing would have earned a high school student a rebuke. The other echo that I thought I recognized related to a drunken magistrate. The judge was a retired post captain in the Navy, and the court was held on board a schooner hired for the purpose, according to de Boilieu. I had encountered that drunken magistrate twice before, once on the storyboards at the museum in Battle Harbor, which quoted de Boilieu, but again in a slightly different form in Augustus G. Lilly and Chris Curran's edit of the Journals of George Sims, J.P. Volume 2. The original journals were in Lilly's possession, as Sims, who in 1832 was clerk of the Court of Civil Jurisdiction for the coast of Labrador and islands adjacent, was a relative of Lilly's, and they were not published until 2017. So it was not possible that de Boilieu had read them, although he might have heard about Captain Patterson and simply co-opted the story for his own purposes. More to the point, de Boilieu claims to have had first-hand experience of this drunken magistrate, but Lilly pointed out that the dates are all wrong, as, quote, there had not been an itinerant court on the Labrador coast since 1833. Although the de Boilieu description is consistent with Captain Patterson's court in every detail, Lilly thought that unless he was using information provided by someone else, de Boilieu was present in Labrador some 30 years prior to the date of publication of his book. Emails from other scholars and writers gave me other helpful suggestions. Although the physical description of the island de Boilieu landed at was probably Great Caribou Island, Battle Harbour not really being a harbour, but a tickle between Great Caribou Island and Battle Island, Eve Luther in Fox Harbour focused on de Boilieu's claim that he walked from his unnamed establishment to the Eskimo encampment. He could not have done that from Battle Harbour, but he could have from Cape Charles. However, Lilly pointed out that de Boilieu says, from the Bay of St. Louis, I took a stroll towards the Eskimo settlement or encampment. This suggests he was not starting from Battle Harbour and perhaps says little about where he was based. Morgan Mills at the Labrador Institute suggested that one of the few reasons researchers used de Boilieu's material, that's the reason so few researchers used de Boilieu's material was because even the first page smells fishy. De Boilieu claims in the second sentence that he was, quote, not at all particular as to which part of the globe I should visit, unquote, which, as Mills writes, is not the way a person winds up in Labrador in 1861 or at any time, but goes on to point out the telltale juxtaposition of precise detail or verisimilitude, illustration, and the omission of basic detail. De Boilieu gives the day and month, but not the year he set sail. The tonnage of the ship, but not its name. Mills concludes, I think it's fairly obvious. This is fiction. Marianne Stopp, the Cultural Resources Advisor for Parks Canada, agreed that de Boilieu's account is charming without a doubt, but maddening to use for research because it isn't firmly rooted in place. It's tough to follow him across the landscape, and even the time frame is too uncertain. However, despite her reservations, she grants de Boilieu some credibility because he seems to have left behind first-hand observations about a time of year, i.e. the winter, that isn't well known for southeastern Labrador. Not all the people I approached had anything to say about de Boilieu. Like some of the other historians I consulted, Sean Cadigan admitted that he didn't remember much about the book. I looked at it in 1987, he wrote, and haven't given it a moment's thought since. Gordon Slade, who was for so long on the board of the Battle Harbour Trust, had heard of de Boilieu, but had never read the book. A few researchers, though none of them historians, seem to have accepted de Boilieu at face value. John C. Kennedy cites de Boilieu 11 times in Encounters and Anthropological History of Southeastern Labrador and quotes him at length with regard to winter houses. He refers to the work as a diary, which it is not. He uses the date of publication, 1861, as the date of de Boilieu's residence in Labrador, though editor Bredin thought it was the 1850s, and it is clear from the text that it was earlier, and he identifies de Boilieu as having managed the firm of T&D Slade at Battle Harbour, although even Bredin does not definitely identify the place or the company he worked for. Laura Kelvin, in her MA thesis of 2011, The Inuit Métis of Sandwich Bay, Oral Histories in Archaeology, refers to him as a superintendent hired by an English firm to manage their Labrador business in the Bay of St. Louis, which may or may not be close to the truth, but which is based solely on Bredin's suggestion. Folklorist Peter Narvaez apparently had no hesitation in using de Boilieu as a source in his work on Newfoundland wakes. He cites him 6 times in his article, Tricks and Fun, Subversive Pleasures at Newfoundland Wakes, although he seems to have misunderstood the location of the wake de Boilieu attended, placing it in Newfoundland rather than Labrador, and he managed to misspell the author's name. Narvaez recognizes that in other cases, someone reporting on Irish-style wakes might be an unsympathetic, sophisticated narrator ridiculing the absurd actions and judgments of inebriates, but apparently is unaware that de Boilieu's clearly expressed opinion of the Irish places him squarely in this role. Others see de Boilieu as a reliable source of information about Labrador. S. Westphal published a piece in Natural History titled Lambert de Boilieu on the Labrador dog, in which he uses de Boilieu to trace the development of the breed. When Audrey Hiscock and Linda Brain compiled their annotated bibliography of Newfoundland materials for school libraries for the Department of Education, they recommended recollections of Labrador life for grades 7 and up. The charm of the writing might make it an appealing book for young readers if it were presented as fiction, but it is described as personal experiences in Labrador in the 1850s, giving an interesting picture of life at that time. Interesting, certainly, but not exactly factual. Most surprising, perhaps, is Maura Hanrahan, who cited de Boilieu in an article for the Canadian Journal of Native Studies in 2000, and again in her report to the Royal Commission on Renewing and Strengthening Our Place in Canada, where she states that although there are others, one of the best accounts of early Métis society comes from trader Lambert de Boilieu, who spoke of his time in the region as being among the Eskimos in St. Louis on the south coast in the 1860s. Despite the fair share of nonsense included in the book, Hanrahan apparently is not disturbed by the complete lack of documentation about the man, his tendency to plagiarize, or the scarcity of corroborating detail. I approached further considerations of recollections of Labrador life with several hypotheses. De Boilieu was an assumed name. He may have been in Labrador 20 or 30 years earlier than Breton and others have suggested, and he borrowed stories or created them to make himself seem more adventurous than he was. At the same time, I felt there was a number of things I could be fairly certain about him. He was English, he was educated, he spent some time in Labrador, most probably on the coast, and he liked to think of himself as a somewhat heroic figure. The suggestion that de Boilieu was a pseudonym is at this point impossible to prove, but it's also impossible to prove that it is not. Gus Lilly tried to track him down through the publisher and managed to find one letter addressed to de Boilieu from Saunders Otley in the archives at the University of Reading. Dated 8th of June, 1864, addressed to D. Boilieu from D. Ferguson, it is a reply to a query from de Boilieu regarding royalties. Ferguson explained that the business had stopped payment the previous year, and all their affairs were being settled by the accountants of the firm Coleman, Turkand, Young & Co. of Tokenhouse Yard. There is no place of residence on de Boilieu's letter. Lilly posits that de Boilieu could well have used a pseudonym in dealing with the public and his publisher. The supposition that de Boilieu was in Labrador in the early 1830s, not the 1850s, as Breton suggests, is partly based on Lilly's explanation that there was no itinerant court in Labrador between 1833 and 1861 when the book was published. However, he suggests other evidence for an early 1830s date related to de Boilieu's concern about the lack of clerical presence in Labrador. De Boilieu claims to have written to the Bishop of Nova Scotia requesting funding to erect a chapel in his community at which he could act as lay reader. Thomas Breton went to some lengths to try and locate this letter or a copy of a reply to it with no success whatsoever. He also failed to find such a letter in the Newfoundland archives, as many such documents had been burned in the fires that razed major parts of the city of St. John's. As Lilly points out, Newfoundland was part of the Diocese of Nova Scotia until 1839, but came under the control of the Bishop of St. John's after that time. It's highly unlikely that the Bishop of Nova Scotia would have had an interest in funding a church in Labrador in the early 1850s, more than a decade after he had been relieved of responsibility for that district. The Church of England had missions in Labrador at Porto in 1849, and the first Church of England place of worship was under construction at Battle Harbour in 1850, with Reverend Henry Disney and Reverend George Hutchison resident there from 1850 to 1867. Suggesting that de Boilieu was not present in those years. Another clue suggesting 1830s rather than 1850s dates for de Boilieu's time in Labrador relates to a visit he made to Newfoundland after having his schooner damaged in a gale. When he arrived, he found people were preparing for an election of members for the Legislative Council. As one old skipper told them, "Rare fun it will be, for the members are elected by universal suffrage, which scarce a man jack of the whole electors know what universal suffrage means." Breden's endnote regarding this points out that the 1855 election was to the Assembly, not to the Legislative Council, whose members were appointed. But Gus Lilly noted that there was a general election in the fall of 1832 when Patterson's court was still working on the Labrador coast. Both the story of the drunken magistrate and the election could have happened at approximately the same time in the 1830s, but not in the 1850s. I see evidence for my assumption that de Boilieu shaped his adventures, real, borrowed, or imagined, to make himself look good as early in the text as page 1 of Recollections of Labrador Life, where he writes about that about 3 a.m. on the 29th of May, one of the youngsters of the brig, a few years my junior, happened to slip overboard from the head. Knowing he could not swim, I, who was a good swimmer, did not hesitate, but leapt into the water, and after some little difficulty, saved him. I'm not sure I would call jumping off a sailing brig in the ice-infested North Atlantic in late May an act of bravery, but rather an act of foolhardiness. The rest of the book is punctuated with acts of daring-do such as this. One has to wonder if Breden too suspected that de Boilieu was perhaps gilding the lily in Recollections. More to the point, perhaps, Breden's 6-page introduction gives a brief history of the discovery and settlement of Labrador by Europeans, but says nothing whatsoever about de Boilieu or T&D Slade of Poole, except in his last paragraph, where he says that the English firms, like T&D Slade of Poole, sent out superintendents like Lambert de Boilieu to manage their Labrador businesses, their stores, and hired servants. Breden is very careful never to say definitively that de Boilieu worked for T&D Slade. He claims that 1850 was the earliest date that de Boilieu could have arrived on the coast, and he did not leave Labrador until 1855 at the earliest, but nowhere does Breden give his reasons for settling on these dates. If Breden suspected some of the information in Recollections was less than reliable, he carefully avoids drawing attention to these problems, unlike at least one of the early reviewers of the book. An introduction to 3 excerpts from the publication appeared in The Scotsman in 1862, in which the reviewer describes the work as, quote, "a little volume crammed with interesting facts and chronicles, which may also be accurate, though they strike those unacquainted with Labrador life as only remarkable if true. Some errors, such as de Boilieu's claim that all the threads used by the Eskimos in the manufacture of boots, skin dresses, etc., comes from the same source, i.e. the windpipe of the square flipper seal, or that Inuit clothing lasts from 10 to 15 years. This could be the result of misunderstanding. However, other supposedly direct observations are clearly someone's idea of a joke or tall tale, possibly Breden's or perhaps his informants. An example of a tale that is remarkable if true is de Boilieu's observing on a visit to Sandwich Bay a method adopted for bringing wood to the coast from farther up the hill. 2 flat pieces of board, about 6 feet long by 3 inches wide, with a strap in the center for the feet to go in, are worn by the woodsmen to descend the hill, not the least exertion being used by them. With a heavy load on their backs, I have seen them slide down erect at almost railway speed. If some version of skis were really being used in this way, it's another indication that the date of de Boilieu's experiences in Labrador are earlier than the 1850s. The first cambered skis were developed between 1840 and 1850. So de Boilieu is describing skis as they might have been prior to that time. While it's true that technology does take a while to get to Labrador, even today, and these could have been homemade skis, skiing with a turn of wood on your back sounds suicidal at best. Another example of de Boilieu's questionable veracity is his claim that when a sunbathing seal's breathing hole freezes over, he can still escape the hunter. He stands, as it were, on his head and using the 4 fins or frippers as a motive power, whirls himself round at an inconceivable speed, The mouth being open during the rotary motion acts somehow as an immense auger and soon penetrates the 5 or 6 inches of new formed ice on the surface of the blowing hole. We have ice in our harbor here at the moment, and there have been seals out there, and I promise you they don't do anything like that. At least one local historian, C.J. Poole, writing about Fox Harbor, Labrador, cites de Boilieu and praises his powers of observation. In Recollections, de Boilieu tells a number of stories intended to show how amiably stupid the Irish were, including an account of a man who attempted to murder his wife by convincing her that near hanging was an ecstatic experience. De Boilieu's Irish were always labeled Paddy and Biddy, but this one instance, he gave them the last name of Glavine, which is also the name of a cove on the inner side of Fox Harbor. Poole was so taken with this anecdote, which even de Boilieu calls absurdly improbable, that he plagiarized the plagiarizer. If de Boilieu was so obviously making up at least some of what he reports in Recollections, the obvious question is why some readers, at least initially, accepted what he wrote as fact. Historian Alan Nevins, in the anthology The Historian as Detective, has argued that an artistic lie is sooner swallowed than a clumsy truth. Early reviewers, like that for The Scotsman, enjoyed de Boilieu's writing, which Bell's Life in London described in 1861 as written in a lively, genial style. Some readers, no doubt, accepted what de Boilieu wrote because it confirmed what they already believed, that the average workman is mired in supreme ignorance, that the Irish are a happy, careless race, that Cartwright was correct when he wrote that the Innu greedily devour the reeking meal and then get drunk and quarrel, lie, and steal. As academics, Hanrahan and Kennedy are both invested in establishing that the Inuit settled on the southeastern coast, and since de Boilieu confirms that, they choose not to notice all the things he wrote that are suspect. De Boilieu is not alone in his apparent tendency to fake his recollections of time spent in a distant land that is not well known to most readers. Alan Nevins, in the case of the cheating documents, identified numerous examples of fiction dressed as absolute fact, including Daniel Defoe's Memoirs of a Cavalier, Sir John Mandeville's Travels, and Parson Weems' Life of George Washington. He speculates that people write such documents for money, power, fame, or to create a national mythology. Yet apparently de Boilieu got none of these things from Recollections of Labrador Life. Nevins goes on to suggest that vanity is often a motive. In reworking an otherwise sparse or boring narrative, the teller's role becomes a little more witty, heroic, or resourceful. This last suggestion would seem to fit what Breton tells us of himself. From the first page, when he plunges into the North Atlantic to save a drowning sailor, de Boilieu depicts himself as a cool observer of lesser men, skirting the coast in command of a 40-ton schooner without a casualty, facing down 3 polar bears in a terrifying standoff before killing them all at close quarters and coolly walking away, surviving nights in the open, and casually losing an eye to an exploding rifle. Nevin also asserts that sometimes a published book bears frank evidence that the text belongs to 2 or more very different dates, which is certainly the case for Recollections. This, Nevin writes, is maddening to the historian who never knows whether a statement upon a man or transaction is authentically of the period or embodies later reflection. He goes on to say that when truth and misstatement are mingled, discovery becomes difficult. When fact and fiction are mixed, it is much harder to identify and often harder to sieve out the truth from the invention. If de Boilieu, whoever he was not in Battle Harbor in the early 1830s, who was? The author of a manuscript known as the Moss Diary, written at Battle Harbor in 1832, was there, working for the Slades. I was told that the diary itself was too fragile to be handled, but a transcript of the diary could be read at the Rooms Archive in St. John's, and after a 4-month pandemic closure in 2020, I was able to get an appointment to view it, hoping against hope that the author of the Moss Diary and Recollections of Labrador Life might turn out to be one and the same person. My first surprise was that the archivist was unable to tell me anything at all about the Moss Diary, not who wrote it, where it came from, not even where the transcript was made or why it was called the Moss Diary. However, a cursory review of the transcript revealed that whoever Moss was, he was not the mysterious Lambert de Boilieu. There are some parallels between the activities of Moss and de Boilieu, such as journeys to nearby settlements and visits from schooner captains and various other travelers. Moss records that on 18th of February, he, quote, made Thomas Blandford's will, that 9 days later, Thomas Blandford departed this life after living on this island as servant of the Messrs. Slade for 45 years, and that on 24th of March, he sold Thomas Blandford's things by auction. De Boilieu records that he attended the deathbed of a poor old man whose will I had made the previous year, and then, having read the service for the burial of the dead over his remains, sold his effects by auction and divided the proceeds as he had desired. Chores such as these might often have fallen to the managers of Slades at Battle Harbour in the course of their service. However, Moss makes no reference at any point to matters of religion. He identifies everyone he deals with by name and title if they have one, and his style is completely different from that of de Boilieu. Furthermore, there is mention in the entry for 26th February of a Mrs. Moss, and then on 6th of September, he writes that Mrs. Moss very bad all day, delivered of a little boy a quarter before 6 in the evening. Secondly, although it would appear that Moss was actively supervising work for the Slades, he was also a very handy fellow to have around, ready to turn his hand to physical labor also. De Boilieu might have been willing to do some of the chores Moss apparently tackled, but given his social class and education, he is unlikely to have had the skills necessary to carry them out. It's interesting to note that John C. Kennedy, who did not hesitate to cite de Boilieu as a source of information about southern Labrador, is initially cautious about using Moss as a source. In his earlier work, People of the Bays and Headlands, he cites Moss 4 times, but introduces his work as the so-called Moss Diary. The so-called disappears after that, though from internal evidence, it is suggested that the author is the husband of Mrs. Moss. Morgan Mills drew my attention to two diaries known to have been written by William Pierce Moss of Twillingate in the 1850s. And some scholars assume this is the man who wrote the Battle Harbour Diary, but William Pierce Moss was only 16 years old in 1854, having been born in 1838. The internet locates dozens of Mosses in Newfoundland, but not one de Boilieu, living or dead, in England or anywhere. As the pandemic lockdown lengthened and time slowed, I began to give as much thought to the mysterious Moss as I had to the mysterious de Boilieu, and I was able to obtain a copy of the transcription of the diary from the rooms for a more leisurely perusal. If Moss wasn't de Boilieu, might there be a hint in the diary as to who was present at that time who might fit the picture of de Boilieu that I had formed? Various characters appear in the diary, including a workman, J. Poole, a shipwrecked Captain Frederick, and a Mr. Crows, but there are also 12 passing references to the movements and activities of a Mr. Simon. With only 3 exceptions, the diary always refers to captains of schooners as captain. The working men are always referred to by their initials and last name. The title Mr. is applied to ship owners and merchants, and to Mr. Simon, who is referred to as Mr. 11 of the 12 times he appears, suggesting that Simon ranks with the author's social superiors. Much of the diary records work assigned and completed, fish caught, wood cut, buildings repaired, boats rigged, seals killed, etc. Mr. Simon never seems to do any actual work other than occasional supervision and hunting birds, a chore that de Boilieu particularly enjoyed. On his excursions, Mr. Simon is usually accompanied by one of the captains and occasionally J. Poole, suggesting that these visits were more for pleasure than business. A closer reading of the diary suggests that the death of Thomas Blandford and the auction of his possessions that Moss records, and the death and auction of the old servant's possessions in Recollections, is not the only parallel to be found between the activities of de Boilieu and Mr. Simon. The elevated social standing Moss suggests for Simon by his use of the title Mr. and by the company he keeps would fit that of a well-educated remittance man like de Boilieu. Mr. Simon sets a few box traps, apparently for fun rather than profit, like de Boilieu. Simon's most frequent chore is gunning for ducks and geese, again like de Boilieu. Mr. Simon does a little coasting trade by schooner, as does de Boilieu, and both make social visits to various communities. Mr. Simon to Fox Harbour, Matthews Cove, and Cape Charles, while de Boilieu goes to Black Bear Bay, St. Michael's Bay, and Sandwich Bay. All of these communities are to be found in what is called southeastern Labrador and are easily accessible to one another particularly if you have the use of a schooner, as did both Simon and de Boilieu. When I suggested these parallels to Gus Lilly, he drew my attention to two appearances of Mr. Simon in the journals of George Sims. Twice Mr. Simon is mentioned in the journal, once when he boarded the Labrador court's schooner Belinda and sold marten skins to Sims, an activity de Boilieu was very familiar with, and again when he gave the court information on American vessels north of Grady Harbor. In other words, Mr. Simon had contact in 1832 with the court of the drunken magistrate de Boilieu claimed to have had dealings with. The appearance of Mr. Simon in George Sims's journals prompted me to try tracking down further information by searching for Simon rather than Moss. One of the first places I looked was in the indexes for Them Days magazine. Two Simons are listed. One, an Inuk known as Simon the Fish Killer, and then 12 entries for a Mr. Simon in 3 back-to-back issues. Apparently, Them Days had published a transcript of the Moss diary under the title Battle Harbor 1832 that appeared to be more accurate than the one at the rooms. A note explained that the diary had been submitted by Newton B. Morgan of Kelligrews, who taught in Labrador for 8 years between 1938 and 1951. The discovery of this slightly different version of the diary solved one small mystery, although it still left the problem of who wrote the diary. C.J. Poole, in his fictional account of Battle Harbor in 1832, Katukto, referred to the work as the Moss Diary in his acknowledgements. But in the body of the work, he refers to Mr. and Mrs. Mop, not Moss, which is consistent with the Them Days transcript. Two anomalies still remained. In the room's transcript, the diarist writes, "Moderate breeze, fine weather, Mr. Moss, Captain Frederick, and myself walked down to the killick stand." In the Them Days transcript, it's Mr. Mop, Captain Frederick, and myself. Unless there were two Mr. Mosses or Mr. Mops at Battle Harbor that spring, Moss or Mop could not have been the diarist. One other anomaly emerged from a comparison of the two transcripts. The sole reference to Simon, which does not refer to him as Mr. in the room's transcript, reads, "2 hands gunning, bracket, Simon and Poole, close bracket, brought in 13 birds." The Them Days transcript reads, "2 hands gunning, J. Simon and J. Poole brought in 13 birds." In the first, Simon seems to be referred to as a han, i.e. a workman. In the second, there's a period after gunning, and the reference to Simon and Poole is bracketed, possibly separating them from the 2 gunners. Moreover, the Them Days reading gives Mr. Simon an initial for the first time. The problem called for a further appeal to the archivist at the rooms. A short explanatory email quickly received a positive response. She'd checked the manuscript, judged that it was in good enough shape to be handled cautiously by an experienced researcher, and furthermore, she had double-checked the handwriting of the name Moss, and I was correct in thinking that the Them Days rendering of Mop was a misreading of the somewhat archaic spelling of Moss with what is called a long S. Obviously, I needed access to the original manuscript. Armed with the room's transcript and the Them Days publication, I was finally able to examine the original diary, a small hand-stitched exercise book with a charmingly simple drawing of the Slade premises at Battle Harbor on the cover. The handwriting was small, but fine enough that a magnifying glass allowed me to get a really good look at the text. Most disagreements between the transcripts seem to be the result of typographical errors rather than misreadings, and with a few exceptions, the Them Days transcript is more accurate than the room's version. One of those exceptions is the entry for May 22nd, which Them Days shows as 2 hands gunning J. Simon and J. Poole brought in 13 birds, but which should be, as the room transcript reads it, 2 hands gunning, bracket, Simon and Poole, close bracket, brought in 13 birds. On April 4th, the room's transcript identified the 2 gunners as M. Simon and J. Poole, which Them Days renders correctly as Mr. Simon and J. Poole. However, after a close examination of the handwriting, I understand why the room's transcriber made this error. The author of the diary frequently used shortened forms of common words, presumably to save space in the tiny booklet, and one way of doing this was to render Mr. as Mr. with a superscript R. Often the R is hardly more than a smudge or a light stroke of the pen. Realizing this led me to solve another anomaly, that of the appearance of a second Mr. Moss in the Good Friday entry. Mr. here has a very finely drawn R with an upturned tail, a tail such as clearly acts as an S elsewhere in the manuscript. It was not Mr. Moss who accompanied Captain Frederick and the author down to Killickstan, but Mrs. Moss. This extra excursion with Mrs. Moss gives a little more weight to the notion that Mrs. Moss is the author's wife, and that he is therefore Mr. Moss. However, it still left both Mr. Moss and Mr. Simon without first names. The 1832 Slade ledgers for Battle Harbor do not appear to have survived, and there are no clues in the Slade correspondence that I was able to locate for that time. However, there was one more piece of information I was able to glean from the diary about the author. He had a daughter, Sarah Ann. On May 13th, 1832, he wrote that he or they put little Sarah Ann in short clothes for the first time. In Newfoundland and Labrador, well into the 20th century, children were shortened or taken out of long clothes and put in dresses or smocks that came only to the feet, usually at about 1 year of age, although sometimes later, depending on how active the child was. When I was a small kid, I remember our housekeeper telling us that she hadn't shortened her child until he was 5 years old. She had his hair cut at the same time when he had to start school. And we all thought it was rather funny because most kids were shortened way, way before that. In the Twillingate marriage registry, I found an entry for Sarah Ann Moss, born November 3rd, 1853, married James Roberts with Robert Moss as one of the witnesses. She would have been about 23 years old, and the brother born in Battle Harbor on September 6th of the year she was shortened would have been 21. Her parents are listed as John Moss and Elizabeth Pierce Moss. John was born at Blandford, Dorset, near Poole, England, moved to Newfoundland when he was 17, and had at least one other son, William Pierce Moss, whose diaries for 1854 and 1875 to 76 are held in the special collections at Memorial University. William Pierce Moss died May 20th, 1883 at the age of 44, and his father, John Moss, died less than 3 weeks later on June 5th, age 83. What have I established with the collective research of a dozen Labrador scholars? In a court of law, a civil case requires proof on the balance of probability, and a criminal case requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Given the evidence, I believe that the author of the Moss Diary to be John Moss of Twillingate is established beyond a reasonable doubt. The fact of de Boilieu's name being a pen name and the date of de Boilieu's sojourn in Labrador to be 1832 rather than 1850s, I submit, is also beyond a reasonable doubt. At this point, the identification of Moss's and Sims's Mr. Simon as de Boilieu might or might not have passed the test of balance of probabilities. I wrote up my findings regarding the identity of the Moss diarist to submit for publication to them days, and also sent it to Gus Lilly, who throughout my research on the identity of de Boilieu was so consistently helpful. I immediately received back an explanation of the long S and how to find that symbol on my computer so that I could write it correctly, and almost immediately after, I received the following additional note from Gus Lilly. I hadn't noticed before, but the Labrador court records transcribed in the Sims Journal, page 226, there appears the case of Robert, David, and James Slade versus Weber and Whiteaway. The case was heard on 13th September 1832, and one John Simon, clerk to the plaintiffs, gave proof to the court. I seem to recall that you mentioned a Mr. Simon being mentioned in the Moss Diary, so this must be the same person. Whether he is the Mr. Simon who sold marten skins to Sims at Indian Island Point du Nord in 1830, page 9, remains unknown. Perhaps I'm naive, but surely only a lawyer could speculate that such a coincidence as a Mr. Simon with an I and a Mr. Simon with a Y could both have been working for the Slades and appearing at the itinerant court in 1830 and 1832. In 1830, Mr. Simon, with an I, sold marten skins to George Sims, who planned to have them made into a muff and tippet for his wife. Mr. Simon's first name and how his last name was spelled were irrelevant to the purchase. However, when in 1832, John Simon, with a Y, gave evidence in a court of law on behalf of his employers, Sims, as clerk of the court, as well as a magistrate himself, would have made it his business to get his first name and to spell the last name correctly. Having got this far, I sent a summary of my findings to some of the researchers who helped me, and also sent Gus Lilly's comments about John Simon. Before long, I got back a reply from Morgan Mills at the Labrador Institute. Morgan suggested a number of possible candidates named John Simon for the relevant period, but instinct tells me that the first one on his list is the mysterious Lambert de Boilieu. John Simon, born about 1802, Middlesex, England, would have been 25 in 1832. According to the 1841 census, he lived at St. Luke, Chelsea, Middlesex, with Harriet Simon, who was 20 years old, probably his wife, whom he would have married well after 1832, given her age, and the census lists his occupation as master mariner. It is that claim to be a master mariner that made this particular John Simon stand out from the others. Boilieu wrote, apropos of a discussion of rendering and shipping of seal oil, the following statement. Talking of ships, I may briefly mention that during my residence in Labrador, I commanded a schooner of 40 tons, and although a young navigator, I cannot help feeling proud that I remember that for 5 years, I skirted the coast without casualty. Clearly, de Boilieu took great pleasure in laying claims to being the skipper of a seagoing vessel, as did John Simon 10 years later. Further research by Morgan Mills turned up another detail of master mariner John Simon's life, none of them related to Labrador, but none of them inconsistent with an early sojourn in that part of the world. John Simon, whose name was often spelled Simons with an S or Simons with a DS, was born 19th of May, 1802, eventually qualified as a master mariner, and in his early 30s married Harriet of the island of St. Helena. They lived at various places in southern England. At age 74, he was retired from the Coast Guard office, and he died sometime between 1881 and 1891 when Harriet was listed as a widow. I'm not sure it can ever be established without doubt that John Simon of Middlesex was the author of Recollections of Labrador Life, but enough of the mystery of that curious book has been uncovered to satisfy at least this puzzled reader. I said at the beginning that there was a lesson to be learned from my experience as a researcher. Always try to work with original documents, but there is a second lesson evident here also. Reach out to other interested researchers for help. I found the cooperation and suggestions that came from others invaluable, and I thank them all, particularly Gus Lilly, who was so patient with my stumbling efforts at solving one of the many mysteries of the history of Newfoundland and Labrador. And thank you all for listening.
You're muted, John.
All right, I'm unmuted now, right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Robin, for quite a journey as a historical detective. It was amazing the amount of research that you did, and as you said, the amount of cooperation you had from other researchers, and the importance of examining original documents whenever possible. So we're at the stage now where we're going to take questions and comments, and encourage people to go to the gallery mode, and so you can see one another, but we'll take questions on the chat line, or you can raise your hand and ask questions or make comments yourself. Leah Griffiths is going to read the chat line questions and acknowledge the speakers if they want to make a comment. Leah?
Okay, well, so far we've got just Rebecca Ralph saying, thank you so much. That was a great tale. I really enjoyed your discussion of archival work.
Good.
Thank you.
Oops. I have a question. I have a comment, actually, and I think I talked about this before. I think that Captain Patterson was not a magistrate. He was a Supreme Court judge, and he was on circuit in Labrador.
Yeah, he's referred to as the drunken magistrate in de Boilieu, which is perhaps why I made that error.
Yeah.
I should have asked you.
Well, I did. You did. Well, I made a comment, and I guess you were busy with other things.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if Gus is there. I don't know if Gus is one of our.
Just a moment. Jack Harris has his hand up.
Okay, where's Jack? There he is.
I'm right here. Yeah, thanks. That was a wonderful presentation, Robin. I like John's description of it as a work of detective research, because indeed it is. You mentioned something about motivation. Before I even came to listen to this, I was wondering myself what motivation someone would have to make up a name and write this thing. And vanity, I think you mentioned as part of it. I suppose that's quite a not unusual sense of why people do things. But there was also mention of royalties, or a request about royalties in the one letter that was discovered. And I'm just wondering, I mean, we hear about vanity novels or vanity press and things these days, people self-aggrandizing. But was that something that was common or very infrequent in those days in the publishing world? Was there a market for this sort of stuff, or is it just an individual quirkiness of this particular individual who wrote that, in your view?
Well, in this case, actually, I cut a section in which I discussed that whole issue of vanity press. The press that published de Boilieu's book went bankrupt. And so they were obviously losing money. But the papers that were filed on it apparently were from a year or two before that. And the suggestion was made by Bill English or possibly Graham, I don't know which, that the logo of the company changed, and at about a year or so before this was published, maybe it was even less than a year, and added was a sort of a motto, and I've forgotten what the motto is now, but it was from a well-known, quite wealthy family, and the suggestion was that in fact somehow Simon was related to them, and that he had provided the money to keep the place going for another short while. So it is vanity press if that's the case, but
Yeah.
that was the speculation.
And hoping to make money, maybe, but the motive was more vanity than money.
I noticed that Gus Lilly is there. He's on mute at the moment. I don't know if he has a comment.
Tim Babcock has his hand up.
Okay. Tim Babcock.
You can unmute yourself.
Okay.
Okay, well, we'll pop over to the chat function then.
Okay.
More accolades. Ellen says, thank you. That was very interesting. And Katrina says, what a fascinating journey. Thank you so much for sharing your work. Mm-hmm. Margot, excuse me, says, has use of this work led to serious misinterpretations of Labrador history?
I'm not sure I'm the one to answer that, but I would think it had to. People swallowed some of this real nonsense, and it gave them very peculiar ideas about Labrador, I think. Whether the issue of what the Inuit being on the southeastern coast, I think they were there. I have speculated myself and read speculations by other people that when the Inuit of the south coast, who are now the Métis people, when they said we're not like those Inuit up there, they actually meant that they were the remains of the Dorset rather than Tully people. And that's a proven fact.
All right. And Katrina asks, might there have been a will for John Harriet Simon?
I don't think so. I didn't look, but I think Morgan Mills did. Mm-hmm. And I didn't know his middle name was Harriet either.
Calvin says, thank you for your presentation. Having researched and written Katuko, I have been mystified about the author Moss and Mr. Mop.
Okay.
And Jeffrey says, I think you make a very convincing case for de Boilieu being Simon, but now that you've found him, are you still trying to find out more about him?
I'd be interested if I tripped over something, but I don't know that I'm going to go looking. I have other fish to fry. I wasted a huge amount of time on this. I didn't waste it, but I spent more time than I really normally needed to.
I can see that Ava Luther is there as well. I don't know if Ava wants to say something.
Oh, her work has been absolutely tremendously useful to me.
Yeah.
She did a complete indexing of the 3 volumes of Cartwright's original journals. And it was thorough and accurate, and it's better than most indexes I ever used.
Oh, and Katrina says, was Harriet the wife of John Simon?
Oh, yes, okay. Harriet, yes.
And Maudie says, thank you. I'm a fan of your Northeast Avalon Times. Now I appreciate your research skills too.
Thank you. It's because I supported the strike, I think.
Chelsea says, an interesting presentation. Thank you. You comment on numerous researchers who used this source. Did you reach out to them?
Some of them, yep. Didn't know where they all were, of course, but those that I was able to ask, I did, because I wanted to know more about it.
Oh, okay. Calvin says, as far as we can determine, J. Poole was my great-great-grandfather. All our research leads to this conclusion.
Well,
Oh, sorry.
That's interesting. I'm just saying, yeah.
And Shannon says, thank you kindly for your work. I was fascinated to hear you lead us through the path of your research.
I'd just like to add that, in fact, quite coincidentally, about a week or two ago, Mary Dalton, your poet laureate there in St. John's, she handed over to me a number of newspaper clippings. One was by Gwyn Dyer about the identity of the person who was supposed to have fixed the Confederation vote and switched the percentages on them. And the other was, what was it? It was a second, basically a literary detective.
And
oh, I remember what it was. This might interest your listeners. The second one was by Patrick O'Flaherty, and it was about the governor who left after Confederation agreement was made. And someone wrote a poem saying farewell and in praise of him. But if you read it, it was, is it called an acrostic, where you read down the first letter of the thing and it said, the bastard. Anyway, somebody figured out, Patrick figured out who that author was.
And Wallace says the reference to the Channel Islands triggered something. And on page 158, it says the South Sea tea cakes are much like the cakes made in the island of Jersey called Mervilles. I'm probably not pronouncing that right. Always struck me that this reference was so precise in an often deliberately vague text.
Well, I think the tonnage of the ship that he came out on was, you know, the sort of thing that maybe a master mariner would know it, but not to have the name or the date.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, the tea cakes is a similar kind of detail thrown in that really is not quite relevant.
Okay, I think we should probably, oh, there's Jacob Backenter would like to make a comment.
Thank you. I cannot start my video, but I hope you can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much for this presentation. Fascinating detective work. One of the things that I find about the text is I wonder if he leaves a few clues inviting us not to take him seriously. I imagine most of his readers were intended to be British. And I'm sure that even they would have known that seals do not auger themselves into the ice. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if he's almost playing, like, at times, I don't know, like a kind of Lewis Carroll type game where he's asking us to believe and not believe at the same time. I can't quite hang a question mark on the end of that, but if you could respond to that, I'd appreciate it. Thank you so much, Robin.
Well, I think that since you're one of the few readers who actually read him and immediately spotted that it was nonsense, that there was something fishy about it, I think you're probably right.
It's a fun game in a way. The text becomes a game.
Well, it's a charming book. I mean, you read
Yeah.
it and you just suck it all in. I mean, I can't believe I read that book 10 to 12 years ago now and didn't really see anything funny about it. I mean, I didn't. And I'm not inexperienced. I didn't know Labrador, but I know all the Canadian Arctic and Alaska. You know, there was enough in there that it should have twigged with me that, you know, there was something funny.
But other details seem maybe genuine too, like some of the folklore he brings in. I don't know. You know, I guess that's the fun of it, or the peril of it is trying to piece it together.
Yeah.
But thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
And Patricia Way says, I love the detailed search. Thank you. The description has not led to any major misinterpretation in my view. I sensed exaggeration in tales, but the Labrador geography, lifestyle, and description fit any knowledge of people as I have found. And Stephen says, well done. You've bested Netflix several times over, but why go to such great lengths to baffle and bamboozle?
You mean, why did he?
Yeah.
I think he did it for the fun of it. I think Jacob's probably right there. He did it because he could.
I think that there's this kind of a mixing of fact and fiction is reasonably common in people who are writing travel books.
Mm.
Like there were two books that came out. One of them was The Iambics of Newfoundland, and there was another one around the same time. One of them was really quite a good book, and the other one seemed to have similar kinds of large errors in it.
And Marianne says, many thanks for a fine presentation, in particular for your systemic research approach. Have you published?
No, but I'm hoping to. I've had it turned down by several journals. It was either not academic enough or too academic. But it will go into, I have had a publisher offer to publish a book called Labrador Observed, A Reader's Guide, which is essentially history of literacy and this kind of thing, but mostly reviews of books about Labrador from very early on.
And Calvin says, we'll never know who wrote the book for sure, but whoever he was, he knew the Labrador coast between Sandwich Bay to Cape Charles.
Well, if it's Simons, he was a master mariner eventually.
Okay, that seems to be all the questions or comments, unless there's another comment there.
Yes, does it qualify as creative nonfiction?
It could.
Okay, so we wind this up. It's been a great pleasure. It's a great pleasure to thank Robin for this presentation. I'm sure you'll all join me in thanking her for what she's done tonight. And we certainly look forward to seeing this work published sometime in the near future.